Hey everyone, welcome to class. Today we're going to be talking about one of the most important things in image creation, and that is composition. Creating a strong composition in your piece of artwork is one of the foundational elements to making a strong piece. This is why understanding what composition is and how it can be used is so important. I know when I was a young artist trying to figure things out, I would often hit this wall where I would want to take my work to the next level, and yet my imaginative pictures would often look the same. Even if I was drawing different pictures of different things, I would struggle to make my images more interesting. I didn't know what I needed to achieve to make my images stronger. And a lot of the time, I thought the way to make my images stronger was simply by adding more detail or strengthening my drawing and painting skills. But I soon realized that composition was one of the key things I didn't understand and was ultimately the thing that was holding back my images from reaching their full potential. So right now, you might be asking yourself, what is composition? And to answer that question, I'm going to bring you to something that we all have experience with: music. And to start things off, I want you to think about your favorite song. Now, I'm going to ask you a few more questions that might sound silly, but bear with me. Can you hear different instruments in your favorite song? Can you hear different notes in your favorite song? Are there parts of the song that are louder or softer than other parts? Now, I'm assuming that the answer is yes. So obviously, we all know that songs are made up of many factors, like the rhythm, the melody, the instruments, the dynamics of the volume, lyrics, etc. And how these musical elements are arranged together determines the sound, the feel, and the content of the music. You can even say how the musical elements are arranged together determines if you like the song or not. So visual arts is pretty much the same. How you arrange the objects, the colors, the values, the narrative will determine the final outcome of your piece. So the same way a composer arranges a song, an artist arranges his or her painting or drawing. And we call this arrangement of elements the composition. If you would like a more formal definition, here it is. The composition is the artistic arrangement of the parts of a picture. So if we like the way a picture is put together, specifically the arrangement of the subjects, we would say that that picture has a strong composition. So now that we know what a composition is, how do we make our compositions more interesting and compelling and just stronger? In order to understand composition in its simplest form, we're going to make compositions with the simplest objects. We're going to limit ourselves to using one triangle, one square, and one circle within a landscape format frame. And I'm going to show you 4 changes that we can make with our objects in order to improve our compositions. So here are the 4 changes we're going to look into: position, scale, overlap, and cropping. Here's what you'll need before we get started with this lesson. We're going to need a piece of paper, a pencil, and a ruler. Now, if you don't have a ruler, anything with a straight edge will work. First, we're going to fold our paper to give us 8 equal rectangles. Each one of these rectangles will act as our frame to explore various compositions. So let's get folding. First, we're going to turn our paper and fold it lengthwise in half. Increase your fold. Next, we're going to fold the paper in half again and crease. And we'll fold it one more time, but this time the opposite way, and crease it once more. After that final fold, we will unfold our paper, and we should have 8 equally sized horizontal rectangles, which will be our 8 frames. You can go ahead and flatten your paper, and we're going to trace our folds with our pencil and ruler so we can see these frames a little bit more clearly. So like I said, we're going to use a triangle, square, and circle to create our little compositions. And within these top 2 frames, we're going to explore how we can enhance our composition through position. The next 2 down, we're going to add scale, and then add overlap, and finally cropping. So let's start with position. Now, if our triangle, square, and circle are positioned perfectly in a line like this, there's technically nothing wrong with that. But I think we can make it a little bit more interesting. One question you may have is, where should I put the objects? This is a great question because depending on what the objects are could determine where they would be placed. For our composition, we're just using abstract shapes, so placement is more about aesthetics than anything else. Now, there are many methods, even mathematical and scientific ones, for determining where to place objects within your frame to create strong compositions. But that is for another lesson on another day. For now, we want to experiment with what we feel looks good. So to answer that question, I would say wherever you feel it looks best. So for these first two frames, try drawing the objects in different positions. And for this part, let's try to keep the objects the same size. Now, after we've finished drawing our objects and positioning them where we would like them to be, we can now think about our next two frames, where we're going to explore scale. Scale is exactly what it sounds like. We're going to try to change the size of our objects to see how that affects the look of our composition. Changing the scale of objects is a great way to add dynamics to your piece by allowing us to emphasize certain objects over others by the difference in size. Very similar to how a musician would emphasize a part of a song with accents, varying volumes, etc. So for these next two frames, go ahead and draw your three objects wherever you want within the frame. But this time, change the size of the objects to however big or however small you would like. Now that we have those two compositions finished, we can move on to the next two frames and add overlapping. Now, overlapping is a little bit more complicated because as an object overlaps another, it obscures our view of the object that's behind it. This can be a little tricky to draw, so let me show you how we can do this easily. Let's say we want our circle and square to overlap. First, we will draw one of those objects. For me, I will start with the square. And the key to this is to draw as light as we can, meaning don't push the pencil down hard onto the paper, and you'll see why soon. Next, we'll draw the circle overlapping the square. And again, we want to do this as lightly as possible. At this point, we have to decide which object will be over the other, the circle on top of the square or the square on top of the circle. For me, I want the circle to be over the square. So wherever I see the square inside the circle, I'm going to erase it. And if I want the square in front of the circle, I would erase the circle wherever it appears in the square. Now, if you drew too dark, meaning you pushed your pencil down too hard onto the paper, erasing this line may be difficult. So a quick tip for all of you is this: always draw lightly until you're certain of what you're drawing. One thing to note as well is that erasing is not a bad thing. It's a part of the process, especially for young artists. So now we know how to draw our overlapping shapes. Why is overlapping important to our composition? Well, learning to overlap shapes is one of the key skills necessary to depict depth within your composition. As soon as you overlap a shape, you're telling the viewer that this object is in front of this object. And just like that, we've created the illusion of depth. Let's take the next two frames to draw our three objects again. And let's be sure to allow at least two of our objects to overlap. Don't forget to apply placement and scale as well. Now we're ready for our last two frames, where we're going to add cropping. Cropping is when we allow the objects in our composition to expand beyond the borders of our frame. It's a great technique because it allows us to stretch the position, scale, and overlapping techniques to their extremes. In a sense, it's a variation of the overlapping technique because we're allowing the frame of our composition to overlap our objects. One concern we've heard from our students while encouraging them to crop things in their pictures is that they don't want their precious drawings to be cut in half. This is a common idea, but it shows the wrong understanding of what's happening. When we crop things with the frame of our composition, those things are not simply disappearing or being cut in half. They're actually moving beyond the edge of our frame. Now, this is a very important concept to understand. When you have all your objects stuck within the frame of your composition, there isn't any indication that there's other things that may be happening outside of the frame. In a sense, the whole environment and worlds of your piece is within the frame. But when you crop, you're telling the viewer that the environment expands beyond the borders of your frame. And so we can think of our frame as a window into the world of your drawing. So when things start to exit your frame, again, they're not just disappearing and they're not just being cut in half, but rather they're moving beyond the frame and into that world. This is one of the greatest techniques for creating believable environments and infinite worlds in your pieces of art. So let's take the last 2 frames of our paper and draw our 3 objects once again wherever we want with different sizes, making sure that at least 2 of our objects are overlapping, and finally making sure that at least 2 of our objects are being cropped by the frame. So now that we've covered position, scale, overlapping, and cropping, and how they can be used to make your composition more interesting and more compelling, we can now use these methods to strengthen our compositions. Now, I know we just drew a bunch of pictures of squares, triangles, and circles, which is not very interesting or fun. But the squares, triangles, and circles were just placeholders for any assortment of objects. You could draw a boat, shark, and helicopter, a spaceship, alien, and planet, or a bear and her 2 little cubs. You could have only one object or a whole bunch of objects with a background. But as you arrange your objects, remember to play around with the position, the scale, try overlapping things and cropping them off the edge of your frame, and remember, draw lightly until you're certain of what you're drawing. Now, one thing that I love about this lesson is that you'll be able to greatly improve your images through more dynamic compositions regardless of your drawing ability. And that's why we're starting the Foundation series with this lesson on composition. Now, it is important to note that this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to understanding and strengthening your composition. But we'll save those deeper principles and methods of composition for another time. For now, keep exploring, learning, and practicing what we learned today. I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and we will see you in the next class.